Chapter 1. The Defiant Wolf. "That worthless beast of yours will get you both killed one day, Kira." The words hit like ice water down her spine, but Kira Thornfield kept scrubbing the stone steps of the training arena, her hands steady even as her chest tightened with familiar shame. She had heard variations of this insult every day for the past 3 years, ever since her wolf had first emerged and refused to show submission to anyone. Not to the pack elders, not to the high-ranking wolves, not even to the ceremonial displays of dominance that every other wolf in the Silvermoon compound performed instinctively. Marcus Blackwood stood over her, his polished boots inches from her raw knuckles, the scent of his authority rolling off him in waves that made normal wolves whimper and bare their throats. But inside Kira's chest, her wolf barely lifted its head, regarding the beta's presence with the same mild interest it might show a passing bird. "I said, look at me when I'm speaking to you." Marcus's voice carried the command that could force submission from any wolf in the pack. Kira felt the familiar pressure against her mind, the weight of his dominance pressing down on her consciousness, demanding acknowledgement, demanding the instinctive bow that marked proper pack hierarchy. Her wolf yawned. The sound that escaped Marcus's throat was pure frustration, a growl that should have sent her scrambling for forgiveness. Instead, Kira continued her methodical cleaning, each scrub of the brush against stone, a steady rhythm that helped her ignore the burning stares of the dozen pack members who had gathered to watch her daily humiliation. "There's something wrong with her," whispered Selena Nightshade, the pack's golden daughter, whose silver-white wolf was everything Kira's stubborn beast was not. Beautiful, obedient, perfectly trained to display the exact degree of submission appropriate to every social situation. "My wolf can barely stand to be near hers. It's like her beast doesn't understand the natural order." Kira's wolf stirred at that, not with submission, but with something that felt almost like amusement, as if it found the entire concept of their natural order to be some kind of elaborate joke that no one else was in on. "Maybe that's because it's not natural for her," said a gravelly voice from behind them. Elder Tobias Ravencrest stepped into the training courtyard, his ancient presence commanding more respect than Marcus's bluster ever could. At 73, he was one of the few pack members who remembered the time before the current Alpha's reign, and his scarred hands spoke of battles that had shaped their territory decades ago. "Some bloodlines run deeper than memory, boy. Some wolves answer to older laws than the ones we practice in this compound." Marcus's face flushed red. "With respect, Elder, there are no older laws than pack hierarchy. Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Omega. Every wolf knows their place, and those who refuse to acknowledge it are either mad or defective." His boot nudged Kira's shoulder, not quite a kick, but close enough to make his point. "Look what 3 years of coddling has gotten us. A wolf that won't submit, won't fight, won't do anything but exist in defiance of everything we stand for." "And yet," Elder Tobias said quietly, "her wolf has never once shown aggression toward a pack member, never challenged, never threatened, never attacked. Tell me, Marcus, in all your wisdom about pack law, what do you call a wolf that shows no submission but also no hostility?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a winter fire. Kira's brush paused against the stone as she felt the attention of every person in the courtyard shift, their gazes heavy with speculation and uncertainty. Because Elder Tobias was right, and everyone knew it. Her wolf's behaviour wasn't just unusual, it was unprecedented. Defiance usually came with aggression, challenge, the instinct to fight for a higher position in the pack order. But Kira's wolf simply existed apart from all of it, as if the entire system was irrelevant to whatever ancient logic guided its behaviour. "The trials begin tomorrow," Celine said into the silence, her voice carrying the sweet poison that made her words cut deeper than shouting ever could. "Every unmated wolf will demonstrate their loyalty to our future Alpha King. Every wolf will show proper submission and respect to the most powerful leader our kind has known in generations." Her pale blue eyes fixed on Kira with predatory satisfaction. "I wonder what happens when a defective wolf is forced to face true authority. Will it finally learn its place, or will it shame our entire pack with its stubborn madness? Kira's wolf went very still at the mention of the Alpha King, not with fear, but with something else entirely. Something that felt like recognition, though that was impossible. She had never met the legendary ruler whose reputation for power and dominance had spread across every pack territory in the northern kingdoms. But her wolf's sudden alertness made her skin prickle with anticipation. She couldn't explain. "The king arrives at sunset," Marcus added, his voice regaining its authoritative edge as he seized on Celine's words. "Every wolf in this compound will show perfect submission when he steps foot on our territory. Every wolf except one, apparently." His gaze bore down on Kira with the weight of absolute certainty. "Your animal's defiance ends tomorrow, one way or another. Either it learns to bow, or it doesn't survive the learning." The threat was clear, and everyone in the courtyard understood its implications. Wolves who couldn't show proper submission to an Alpha King were considered rogues, dangerous elements that had to be eliminated for the safety of the pack. Tomorrow's trials weren't just ceremonial displays of loyalty, they were tests that could mean life or death for those who failed to meet expectations. But as Kira finally looked up from her scrubbing, meeting Marcus's eyes with the steady gaze that had never once wavered in 3 years of daily intimidation, her wolf settled into a calm that felt almost like confidence. Not the resignation of defeat, but the patience of something waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. "We'll see," she said quietly, the first words she had spoken since the confrontation began. "We'll see what happens when my wolf meets yours tomorrow." The dismissal in her tone was subtle but unmistakable, and the shocked silence that followed it told Kira that everyone had heard what she couldn't quite bring herself to say aloud. That maybe, just maybe, they were all wrong about which wolf would be doing the bowing when the Alpha King arrived. Inside her chest, her wolf lifted its head and smiled. Chapter 10. The Truth Unveiled. The great hall of the Silver Moon compound had never hosted a gathering quite like this one. Dawn light streamed through the massive windows, illuminating an assembly that included not just the local pack leadership, but representatives from 7 allied territories, all drawn together by Celine Nightshade's claims of supernatural threat and political necessity. Kira stood in the centre of the hall, with her hands bound in silver chains that burned against her skin, but her golden eyes blazed with inner fire that made even the most confident pack leaders shift uncomfortably in their seats. The silver markings along her arms had grown more pronounced overnight, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light, despite the suppressant metals wrapped around her wrists. "This is what we're supposed to fear?" scoffed Alpha Theodore Ironwood, his massive frame radiating the kind of casual dominance that had made his territory one of the most feared in the northern kingdoms. "A girl barely out of her teens whose wolf refused to submit. I've seen rogues with more presence than this supposed threat to our entire civilization." But Elder Tobias Ravencrest stepped forward from the crowd of witnesses, his weathered hands carrying a leather satchel that seemed to radiate age and significance like a relic from another era. "Perhaps, Alpha Ironwood, you should know exactly what you're looking at before you dismiss it so casually." He opened the satchel and withdrew documents so ancient that the parchment seemed to glow with its own inner light, symbols and bloodline charts that predated the establishment of any territory represented in the hall. Luna Isabel Thornfield, née Moonspear, last surviving heir of the Wolf Lord dynasty that ruled the northern kingdoms for 8 centuries before the Great Purge. The names fell into the assembled crowd like stones thrown into still water, sending ripples of shock and recognition through pack leaders who had grown up on legends of the ancient bloodlines that had once commanded powers beyond anything their modern world had ever witnessed. "Impossible," breathed Alpha Margaret Stormcrest, her voice cracking with the strain of processing information that threatened to overturn everything she thought she knew about supernatural hierarchy. The Moonspear line was extinct. Every heir was accounted for and eliminated during the purge. There were no survivors. Elder Tobias smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had waited 30 years to deliver this revelation. No survivors that you knew about, but Luna Isabel and her mate Gabriel had taken precautions, hidden their daughter so completely that even the most thorough investigations found no trace of her existence. He gestured toward Kira with reverence that made every person in the hall suddenly aware they were witnessing something historic. Behold Kira Thornfield, rightful heir to bloodlines that your ancestors swore fealty to, whose wolf carries genetic memory of powers that shaped this world long before your territories were even conceived. The silver chains around Kira's wrists began to smoke as her power tested their containment, ancient abilities pushing against modern suppressants with increasing pressure that made the very air in the hall shimmer with barely contained force. When she spoke, her voice carried the dual-tone resonance that marked the most powerful supernatural bloodlines, reaching into the souls of everyone present with authority that transcended political position. "You want to know why my wolf never submitted to your pack leaders?" she asked, her golden gaze sweeping across the assembled crowd with regal dignity that made seasoned alphas suddenly feel like children being judged by their ancestors. Because it was bred from lines that bowed only to their equals, because it carries the genetic memory of creatures who commanded the elements themselves, who spoke to wild dragons and negotiated treaties with forces that exist beyond your comprehension. Alpha Ironwood surged to his feet, his own wolf pressing against his consciousness with desperate need to assert dominance over something that threatened his understanding of the natural order. Pretty words from someone in silver chains. If you're truly from such a powerful bloodline, why haven't these legendary abilities manifested before now? Why did it take 30 years for you to discover this supposed heritage? The answer came not from Kira, but from a voice that made every person in the hall freeze with sudden recognition of genuine authority. King Lysander Blackthorn stepped into the great hall with presence that immediately shifted every power dynamic in the room, his dark eyes blazing with fury that made the stone walls tremble with supernatural force. "Because," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with the kind of authority that could reshape kingdoms, her parents had her abilities bound by ancient magic to protect her from exactly the kind of political assassination that you're attempting to legalize today. He held up a crystal vial that seemed to contain liquid starlight, symbols etched into its surface that matched the markings now blazing along Kira's arms. This contained the suppressant that has been keeping her bloodline dormant for 18 years, administered monthly by someone who understood that the daughter of Luna Isabel would need to survive long enough to reclaim her birthright when the time was right. The implications of his words hit the assembled pack leaders like a physical blow. Someone within their own territories had been protecting the heir to a bloodline they thought extinct, maintaining a conspiracy that had lasted for decades while they built their power structures on the assumption that the Wolf Lord dynasties were gone forever. "Who?" demanded Alpha Stormcrest, her voice tight with the kind of rage that came from realizing she had been outmaneuvered by forces she had never even known existed. "Who has been hiding this information? Who betrayed the agreements that have kept our territories stable for 30 years? Elder Tobias straightened to his full height, ancient courage blazing in his eyes as he finally revealed the truth he had guarded for 3 decades. "I have. Every month for 18 years, I ensured that Luna Isabel's daughter remained hidden and protected until she was strong enough to survive the revelation of her heritage." The confession hung in the air like thunder before a storm, carrying with it the knowledge that one of their most respected pack elders had been working against everything they thought they had accomplished. But before anyone could respond with the outrage and accusations that such a revelation demanded, Kira's power finally overwhelmed the silver chains that bound her. The suppressant metal shattered like glass, fragments spinning away in spirals of golden light as her abilities erupted with the force of a dam finally bursting after years of containment. Ancient symbols blazed along her skin like living fire, and her eyes became pools of molten gold that seemed to look directly into the souls of everyone present. "You want proof of my bloodline?" she asked, her voice echoing with harmonics that made the great hall's stone pillars ring like struck bells. "You want evidence that the Wolf Lord dynasties still exist?" Power erupted from her in waves that made every wolf in the hall cry out with voices that carried across the compound like prayers offered to forces they had thought were myths. The very air crackled with electricity as she demonstrated abilities that had been sleeping in her genetic code, waiting for the right moment to emerge and reclaim a heritage that had been stolen from her family. And in that moment of explosive revelation, with golden light blazing around her like a crown made of starfire and ancient power flowing through her veins like liquid destiny, every person in the great hall finally understood what they were truly facing. Not a rogue threat to be eliminated, but the rightful heir to powers that had shaped their world, returning to claim a birthright that had been hidden but never truly lost. The silence that followed was the kind that preceded either surrender or war, and as Kira stood blazing with inherited power in the centre of the hall where her enemies had tried to judge her, everyone present knew that the next words spoken would determine whether the Northern Territories would accept the return of their ancient rulers or fight against destiny itself. You won't believe what happens next. The Alpha King is about to make a declaration that will shake the very foundations of pack society. If you're as captivated by this incredible power reveal as we are, make sure to subscribe with notifications on, because what comes next is going to be absolutely epic. Trust me, you don't want to miss the Alpha King's response to seeing his mate in her full glory. Chapter 11. The Challenge. The golden light that blazed around Kira began to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, ancient power flowing through her veins like liquid fire as she stood in the centre of the great hall, surrounded by pack leaders whose entire worldview had just been shattered. The silence that followed her explosive demonstration stretched like a wire pulled too tight, pregnant with the kind of tension that preceded either surrender or violence. It was Alpha Theodore Ironwood who broke first, his massive frame trembling with the effort of containing rage that had been building since the moment Elder Tobias revealed the truth about bloodlines they had spent 30 years believing were extinct. "I don't care what documents you wave around or what pretty light show she can produce. The Great Purge happened for a reason. The Wolf Lord dynasties were eliminated because they posed an existential threat to the stability of our territories." His words carried the desperate edge of someone clinging to justifications that were crumbling beneath the weight of undeniable evidence. But they also carried something more dangerous, the kind of willful blindness that would rather destroy truth than accept it. The same mentality that had driven his ancestors to participate in genocide, disguised as political necessity. "You're right about one thing," Kira said, her voice carrying across the hall with the dual-tone resonance that made the stone pillars ring with harmonics that seemed to reach into the souls of everyone present. "My bloodline is a threat to your territories, not because we seek to dominate or destroy, but because we represent everything you've built your power on lies designed to conceal." She stepped forward, and despite the silver chains that had been binding her lying in shattered fragments around her feet, every pack leader in the hall felt the instinctive urge to retreat from something whose presence suddenly seemed to fill the entire space with barely contained force. "The Great Purge wasn't about protecting stability," she continued, golden eyes blazing with inner fire as ancient memories flowed through her consciousness like inherited rage given voice. "It was about eliminating the only bloodlines powerful enough to hold you accountable for the atrocities you committed while building your territories. It was about making sure that no one remained alive who remembered what honour and justice actually looked like when they governed supernatural society." Alpha Margaret Stormcrest surged to her feet, her own wolf pressing against her consciousness with desperate need to assert dominance over something that threatened everything she had spent decades building. Even if what you say is true, even if your bloodline carries the power you claim, that doesn't give you the right to return after 30 years and destabilize treaties that have kept our territories from descending into chaos. Doesn't it? The question came from King Lysander Blackthorn as he stepped fully into the great hall, his presence immediately shifting every power dynamic in the room as he moved to stand beside Kira, with the kind of deliberate solidarity that made political alliances and territorial agreements suddenly seem insignificant compared to forces that transcended human law. You speak of treaties and stability as if they were sacred things deserving of protection, he continued, his dark eyes sweeping across the assembled pack leaders with the kind of judgment that had once reduced entire armies to ash and bone. But what you've really created is a system built on the graves of better people than yourselves, maintained through the systematic suppression of anyone whose existence reminds you that there are alternatives to rule through fear and domination. The accusations hit the assembled crowd like physical blows, carrying with them the weight of absolute authority from someone whose bloodline had never forgotten what it meant to rule through strength tempered with justice rather than simple brutality disguised as order. "This is madness," Alpha Ironwood snarled, his composure finally cracking completely as he faced the possibility that everything he had built his identity around was being called into question by forces he lacked the power to control. You would have us tear down 30 years of carefully negotiated peace for the sake of some romantic fantasy about ancient bloodlines and noble savages who ruled through mystical connection to forces that no longer exist in our world. "Then prove it," Kira said quietly, and something in her tone made every person in the hall suddenly aware that they were about to witness something that would be remembered long after everyone present had returned to dust. "If my bloodline is truly extinct, if the Wolf Lord dynasties really pose no threat to your superior civilization, then it should be simple to demonstrate that superiority through direct challenge." The formal words of combat trial hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down before assembled armies, carrying with them implications that made even the most confident pack leaders suddenly aware of exactly what kind of forces they had been attempting to suppress and eliminate. "You're challenging the territorial leaders to formal combat?" Alpha Stormcrest asked, her voice cracking with disbelief at the audacity of someone barely out of her teens offering to fight seasoned warriors whose reputations had been built on decades of successful dominance battles. "I'm challenging the legitimacy of your entire system," Kira replied, power beginning to coil around her like visible heat as her wolf prepared for the kind of confrontation that would determine not just her own fate, but the future of every bloodline that had been driven into hiding by 30 years of systematic oppression. Single combat, ancient rules, with the understanding that victory proves the worthiness of the victor's bloodline to rule, and the unworthiness of the defeated to continue holding power they never deserved. The challenge carried weight that transcended modern political structures, reaching back to laws and customs that predated the establishment of territorial boundaries and touched on the most fundamental principles of supernatural society. It was the kind of formal trial that could not be refused without acknowledging cowardice, the ultimate test of whether might truly made right or whether justice carried its own kind of strength. Alpha Ironwood's response was a laugh that carried no humour, only the harsh sound of someone whose certainty was being tested by forces he had never expected to face. "You want to fight me? A child whose greatest accomplishment is producing pretty lights and breaking some silver chains? I've killed rogues with more combat experience than you've had time to accumulate in your entire life." But as he spoke, his eyes never left the silver markings that blazed along Kira's arms, ancient symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner life as power built beneath her skin like pressure in a sealed container. Because whatever else he might claim about her inexperience, Everyone in the hall could feel the forces gathering around her, could sense that they were about to witness a demonstration of abilities that had been sleeping in her genetic code for 18 years. "Then it should be easy," she said simply, and began to shift. The transformation that flowed through her was nothing like the careful, controlled change she had maintained for years under the suppressants. Instead, it was an explosion of silver light and ancient power that filled the great hall with energies that made every wolf present cry out with voices that carried harmonics of recognition and terror combined. When the light faded, the creature that stood where Kira had been bore only passing resemblance to the ordinary wolf that had knelt in submission trials just days earlier. Silver-grey fur gleamed with inner luminescence that seemed to draw light from the air itself. Golden eyes blazed with intelligence and power that reached into the souls of everyone present, and along her massive frame ran patterns of living silver that marked her as heir to bloodlines that had once commanded the respect of dragons themselves. Alpha Ironwood's shift was impressive by any normal standard, producing a dark brown wolf whose size and presence had dominated countless territorial disputes throughout his rise to power. But standing across from Kira's transformed state, he suddenly looked small, ordinary, like a shadow attempting to challenge the sunrise. The battle that followed was less a fight than a revelation, a demonstration of what happened when someone trained in modern combat techniques faced abilities that reached back to the foundations of their world. Kira moved with fluid grace that made her seem like she was flowing through water while her opponent struggled through thick mud, her attacks carrying the precision of inherited knowledge while his bore only the crude effectiveness of learned brutality. When it was over, when Alpha Ironwood lay unconscious on the great hall's stone floor, with silver burns marking where her power had touched him, the silence that filled the space carried a different quality than before. Not the tension of coming conflict, but the stillness of witnessing judgment being passed and found absolute. King Lysander stepped forward and placed his hand on Kira's transformed head, his touch gentle despite the tremor in his fingers that spoke to barely controlled emotion. "Let the record show," he said, his voice carrying across the hall with the authority of someone whose word could reshape kingdoms, "that combat trial has been met and won, that the heir of the Moonspear bloodline has proven her worthiness to claim her heritage, and that I, Lysander Blackthorn, King of the Northern Territories, formally acknowledge her as my equal partner and chosen mate." The declaration hit the assembled pack leaders like a meteor strike, carrying with it the knowledge that everything they thought they understood about power and politics and the natural order of their world had just been permanently altered by forces they lacked the wisdom to have prevented. And as Kira shifted back to human form and accepted the hand that her mate extended to help her stand, golden light blazing around them both like a crown made of starfire, everyone present finally understood that they were witnessing not just the end of one era, but the beginning of another entirely. Chapter 12. The Royal Future. 3 months had passed since the Great Hall had witnessed the impossible, since ancient bloodlines had risen from supposed extinction and shattered every assumption about power and worthiness that had governed the Northern Territories for 30 years. The compound that had once echoed with whispers about the defective wolf girl now hummed with the respectful murmur of pack members who had learned to recognize true royalty when it walked among them. Kira stood on the balcony of the royal quarters, her golden eyes surveying the territories that stretched beyond the horizon, like a living map of everything that had changed since she had finally claimed her heritage. The silver markings along her arms had settled into elegant patterns that caught the afternoon sunlight and reflected it back as something more luminous, more alive than mere decoration. She wore them now like the crown they had always been, symbols of a bloodline that had never truly died but had merely been waiting for the right moment to emerge from the shadows. The political upheaval that had followed her victory over Alpha Ironwood had been swift and decisive. Pack leaders who had built their authority on the systematic suppression of older bloodlines found themselves facing a choice between acknowledging the new reality or discovering exactly what happened to those who continued to oppose forces they lacked the power to control. Most had chosen wisdom over pride, bending the knee to rulers whose legitimacy had been proven through combat rather than political manoeuvring. Those who had refused to accept the restoration of the Wolf Lord dynasties had simply disappeared, not through violence or the kind of brutal purges that had marked their own rise to power, but through the quiet justice of being stripped of territories they had never deserved and exiled to the borderlands where their diminished authority could harm no one but themselves. "You're thinking too hard again," came a familiar voice from behind her, warm with the affection that had grown between them, as they learned to balance the supernatural bond that connected their souls with the very human love that had developed through shared trials and mutual recognition. Kira smiled without turning, her enhanced senses picking up every detail of Lysander's approach long before his massive frame appeared in her peripheral vision. "I'm thinking about how different everything looks from up here, how small the problems that once seemed insurmountable appear when you have the perspective to see them as part of a larger pattern." He moved to stand beside her at the balcony's edge, his presence still carrying the overwhelming authority that marked him as one of the most powerful alphas their kind had ever known, but tempered now with the kind of contentment that came from finding someone whose strength complemented rather than competed with his own. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question carrying depths of meaning that touched on everything they had sacrificed and gained in the process of claiming their destiny together. "About which part?" Kira replied, leaning into the warmth of his embrace as golden light flickered between them. The mate bond that had sparked in the ceremonial arena now settled into the steady glow of connection that would last for the rest of their lives. "About discovering that everything I thought I knew about myself was a carefully constructed lie. About learning that my parents died to protect secrets that shaped the entire supernatural world. About accepting that I carry the responsibility for bloodlines that were nearly extinct. About choosing this life over the simple existence you could have had if you'd never awakened to your true nature." The question touched on fears she had carried through every transformation, every revelation, every moment when the magnitude of her heritage had threatened to overwhelm the girl who had once scrubbed floors and endured daily humiliation in service to people who would have killed her if they had known what she truly was. "I think about her sometimes," Kira admitted, her voice soft with the kind of reflection that came from having travelled so far from her origins that they seemed like memories from another lifetime. The girl who believed she was nothing, who thought her wolf's refusal to submit was evidence of some fundamental brokenness that marked her as unworthy of love or respect or belonging. And I understand now that she was never broken. She was sleeping. Kira turned in his arms, her golden eyes meeting his dark gaze with the kind of certainty that had been forged through trials that would have destroyed lesser souls. Everything she endured, every humiliation and dismissal and moment of being told she was worthless, was preparing her for this moment, teaching her that worth comes from within, that power without compassion is just another form of weakness, that true strength reveals itself not through domination, but through protection of those who cannot protect themselves. The wisdom in her words carried the weight of experience transformed into understanding, pain alchemized into the kind of insight that could reshape worlds. And as Lysander looked into her transformed features, he saw not just the mate whose bond completion had fulfilled prophecies written in the stars, but the queen whose reign would mark the beginning of an era where justice and mercy would again walk hand in hand through their territories. "There's something else," he said, his voice carrying the particular tone that meant he was about to share news that would change everything yet again. "The healers confirmed it this morning. Your body is showing all the signs that typically accompany the early stages of carrying an heir." The words hit Kira like lightning striking still water, sending ripples of shock and joy and terror through her consciousness, as the implications of what he was telling her began to crystallize into reality. A child, their child, the next generation of bloodlines that had survived genocide and suppression and 30 years of systematic attempts at extinction. "How long?" she whispered, her hands moving instinctively to cover her still flat stomach, where new life was beginning the ancient process of transforming possibility into actuality. "Perhaps 6 weeks, maybe 8. His own hands covered hers, large and warm and trembling slightly, with emotions too complex for simple categorization. "Long enough for the bond to have stabilized, for your awakened abilities to have settled into patterns that can be safely passed to the next generation." Kira felt her wolf stir with protective instincts so fierce they made her previous transformation seem pale by comparison, ancient maternal drives awakening alongside the knowledge that she carried not just a child, but the future of bloodlines that had nearly been lost forever. The responsibility was overwhelming, but underneath the fear was something else entirely. The bone-deep satisfaction of knowing that her parents' sacrifice had not been in vain, that the heritage they had died protecting would continue into another generation. "What do we tell them?" she asked, gesturing toward the territories that spread beyond the balcony, where hundreds of thousands of pack members were still adjusting to the reality of having their entire social structure transformed by the return of rulers they had thought were myths. "The truth," Lysander replied simply, "that the Wolf Lord bloodlines are not just returning from extinction, but growing stronger with each passing day. That the future belongs to those who can adapt to the restoration of ancient justice rather than clinging to the corrupt systems that replaced it. That our child will be raised knowing both the strength of their heritage and the responsibility that comes with carrying power others would kill to possess." As if summoned by their conversation, Elder Tobias appeared in the doorway of the royal quarters, his weathered face bright with the satisfaction of someone who had lived to see prophecy fulfilled exactly as the ancient texts had foretold. "Your Majesties, if I might have a moment, there are things about the child's bloodline that you should understand before the pregnancy progresses much further." Kira and Lysander exchanged glances that carried volumes of unspoken communication, the kind of perfect synchronization that marked true partnerships forged in the crucible of shared trials. Whatever revelations the elder was about to share, whatever complications their child's mixed heritage might create, they would face them as they had faced everything else since the night her wolf had refused to bow in the ceremonial arena. Together, as equals, as mates whose bond had been recognized not just by the supernatural forces that governed their world, but by their own hearts, which had chosen love over political convenience and truth over comfortable lies. And as golden light began to pulse around them both, responding to the new life growing within Kira's transformed body, everyone present understood that they were witnessing not just the continuation of ancient bloodlines, but the beginning of a dynasty that would reshape the supernatural world for generations to come. The girl who had once been told she was nothing had become everything she was meant to be. The wolf that had refused to kneel had found the only alpha worthy of her recognition. And the love story that had begun with impossible recognition in a ceremonial arena was now writing itself into the history books as the legend of how two souls, destined for each other, had reclaimed a heritage that had been stolen but never truly lost. Their story was just beginning. If this incredible journey of transformation and true love has captured your heart the way it's captured ours, please share it with someone who believes in the power of hidden strength and destined connections, and let us know in the comments. Did you predict that Kira would turn out to be royal blood, or were you as shocked by the revelation as the pack leaders? We love hearing from you about these epic love stories that remind us all that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones the world tries hardest to convince are worthless. Chapter 2. The arena awaits. The hours before dawn were Kira's only refuge from the constant scrutiny that followed her through the Silver Moon compound. She moved through the empty corridors like a ghost, her bare feet silent against the cold stone floors as she made her way to the ceremonial arena. The massive circular space would soon be filled with hundreds of pack members and visiting dignitaries, all gathered to witness the trials that would demonstrate their loyalty to the Alpha King. But for now, in the pale grey light that preceded sunrise, it belonged only to her, and the task of preparing it for the most important ceremony their pack had hosted in decades. Kira pulled her cleaning supplies from the storage alcove and began the methodical process of scrubbing away yesterday's training marks from the arena floor, blood from sparring matches, scuff marks from clawed feet, the lingering sense of dominance and submission that clung to every surface like invisible stains that only wolf senses could detect. Each stroke of her brush was meant to create a neutral space, free from the residual emotions that might interfere with today's displays of pack hierarchy. Her wolf stirred restlessly as she worked, pacing back and forth inside her chest with an agitation that had been building for days. Not the nervous energy she might have expected before such an important event, but something that felt almost like anticipation, like it was waiting for something specific to happen, something that would finally make sense of the restless energy that had been coiling tighter with each passing hour. "Easy," she whispered to the beast that shared her soul. "Whatever happens today, we'll face it together." The wolf's response was a soft whine that carried undertones of longing so profound it made her breath catch, as if her animal knew something she didn't, some crucial piece of information that her human mind couldn't access, but that called to every instinct her wolf possessed. Voices echoed from the corridor outside the arena, growing louder as the first wave of pack members arrived for the pre-ceremony preparations. Kira recognised the distinctive laugh of Connor Stormwind, one of the pack's most promising young warriors, and the answering chuckle of his training partner Derek Moonfall. Both wolves were everything the pack valued, strong, obedient, perfectly attuned to the hierarchy that governed every interaction within their territory. "My wolf's been on edge all week," Connor was saying as they entered the arena. "Started the moment we got word that the Alpha King had crossed into our territory. Hell, I think every wolf in the compound has been feeling it, the pressure of his presence, even from miles away." Derek nodded, running a hand through his dark hair as his eyes swept the arena with obvious nerves. "My handler says it's normal. That true alphas project their dominance like a tide, and lesser wolves feel it in their bones days before they arrive. Shows that our animals know their place in the natural order." Kira kept her head down, focusing on the stubborn stain that refused to lift from the arena floor, but she couldn't ignore the conversation happening just yards away from her. Because what Connor and Derek were describing, that overwhelming pressure of approaching dominance, was something she had been completely unable to feel. Her wolf showed no signs of the nervous submission that every other pack member was experiencing. If anything, her animal seemed calmer than usual, as if the Alpha King's approach was somehow soothing rather than intimidating. "Look at that," Connor said, his voice dropping to the particular tone that meant he was about to say something cruel. Even now, with the most powerful alpha in the Northern Kingdoms less than a day away, Kira's broken wolf isn't showing any reaction at all. No submission, no fear, no acknowledgement that it's about to face judgment from its superior. Derek's response carried the casual cruelty of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. "Maybe it really is too damaged to understand what's coming. Some wolves are born defective, and no amount of training or discipline can fix what nature got wrong." His laugh was sharp and cold. "Should be interesting to see what happens when an animal that refuses to submit meets one that demands absolute obedience from every living thing in its presence." The scrub brush in Kira's hand stilled as her wolf suddenly went rigid with attention. Not fear, not submission, but something that felt like recognition, as if Derek's casual description of the Alpha King had triggered some deep knowing that her animal had been carrying without her conscious awareness. "Handler Blackwood says there are protocols for defective wolves," Connor continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone repeating pack lore he had memorized but never questioned. "Animals that can't show proper submission to an Alpha King are considered rogue threats. They either learn their place in that moment or they're put down before they can contaminate other pack members with their dysfunction. The words should have filled Kira with terror, should have sent her wolf into the desperate submission posture that might save both their lives when the trials began. Instead, her animal settled into a stillness so profound it felt like the calm before a storm, a patience that spoke of something waiting to be revealed rather than something preparing to be destroyed. She rose from her knees, gathering her cleaning supplies with hands that remained steady despite the life or death implications of what she had just heard. Connor and Derek watched her with the casual interest of spectators at an execution, clearly expecting some sign of the fear that any rational person would feel in her position. "Aren't you worried?" Derek asked, genuine curiosity colouring his voice. "About what happens when your wolf faces real authority, when it finally meets power it can't ignore or dismiss." Kira paused at the arena's exit, her hand resting on the stone archway that would frame today's ceremonies. For a moment she considered giving them the response they expected, the acknowledgement of her animal's defectiveness and her own terror at the coming judgment. It would be easier, safer, to play the role of the broken wolf girl who knew her place at the bottom of their hierarchy. But her wolf stirred at the thought, not with agreement, but with something that felt almost like amusement, as if the very concept of her animal being broken or defective was so far from the truth that it bordered on absurd. "My wolf isn't afraid," she said quietly, the words emerging from some deep place of certainty she hadn't known she possessed. "It's been waiting." The confession hung in the air between them, carrying implications that none of them fully understood, but that made the hair on the back of Kira's neck rise with sudden awareness. Because as she spoke the words, she realised they were absolutely true. Her wolf hadn't been defying authority for 3 years, out of stubbornness or damage or inability to understand pack hierarchy. It had been waiting for the right authority to arrive, something that deserved its acknowledgement, something that matched whatever ancient standard lived in her animal's bones, some criteria for worthiness that had nothing to do with the political structures that governed the Silver Moon compound, and everything to do with forces far older than any pack law. "Waiting for what?" Connor demanded, but Kira was already walking away, her wolf humming with anticipation that felt like coming home after a long journey through foreign territory. Tonight, when the Alpha King stepped foot in their territory, she would finally understand what her animal had been waiting for, and somehow, despite every logical reason to be terrified, she found herself looking forward to the moment when that waiting would finally end. Chapter 3. The Alpha King arrives. The sun had barely touched the western horizon when the first wave of his presence hit the compound like a physical force. Kira felt it as a tremor in the stone beneath her feet, a vibration that seemed to rise from the earth itself and travel up through her bones. Around her, every wolf in the ceremonial arena went rigid with sudden awareness, their heads turning toward the main gates with expressions of awe and terror that spoke to instincts older than conscious thought. But her wolf remained perfectly still, not with the frozen paralysis of fear, but with the focused attention of a predator recognizing something significant approaching its territory, something that demanded acknowledgement not through submission, but through careful evaluation. "He's here," whispered Celine Nightshade, her usually perfect composure cracking as her silver-white wolf pressed against her consciousness with desperate need to show proper deference. "The Alpha King is actually here." The gathered pack members shifted restlessly, their animals responding to the approaching dominance with the automatic submission that had been bred into their bones across generations. Heads lowered, shoulders hunched, every posture screaming acknowledgement of a superior predator entering their space. The very air seemed to thicken with the weight of supernatural authority that preceded the legendary ruler like a living thing. Except Kira stood exactly as she had moments before, her spine straight and her gaze fixed on the ceremonial gates where the Alpha King would make his entrance. Her wolf stirred with what felt like anticipation rather than intimidation, as if it recognized something in that approaching presence that resonated with forces buried deep in her own genetic memory. "Look at her," hissed Marcus Blackwood, his voice tight with the strain of fighting his own wolf's desperate need to prostrate itself before power it had never encountered. Even now, with that level of dominance bearing down on us, her animal shows no reaction, no fear, no submission, no acknowledgement that it's about to face judgment from the most powerful alpha our kind has ever known. Elder Tobias Ravencrest watched Kira with ancient eyes that seemed to see more than the surface of what was happening around them. "Perhaps," he said quietly, "her wolf recognizes something the rest of us have forgotten." The massive ceremonial gates swung open with a sound like thunder, and suddenly the Alpha King was there, framed in the stone archway like something out of legend made flesh. Power rolled off him in waves so intense that several pack members stumbled under the weight of it, their wolves crying out in voices that carried across the arena like prayers offered to a living god. He was tall, broader than any man had a right to be, with dark hair that caught the torchlight like shadow-given substance, and eyes that seemed to hold depths no mortal gaze should possess. But it was the aura of absolute authority surrounding him that marked him as something beyond ordinary wolf kind, a presence so overwhelming that the very stones of the arena seemed to recognize his supremacy and bend in acknowledgement. Every wolf in the compound immediately dropped into submission postures so profound they bordered on worship. Heads to the ground, throats bared, entire bodies trembling with the need to demonstrate their unworthiness before such magnificent power. The sound of hundreds of people falling to their knees created a wave of movement that swept across the arena like wind through wheat. Every wolf except one. Kira remained standing, her wolf coiled in her chest with an attention so focused it felt like being struck by lightning. Not submission, not fear, but recognition so profound it stole the breath from her lungs and made her heart race with something that felt like coming home after a lifetime of exile. The Alpha King's gaze swept across the sea of prostrated pack members with the casual acknowledgement of someone accustomed to absolute deference. But when his eyes found hers, when that impossible stare locked onto the one person in the arena who remained upright in his presence, everything else seemed to fall away into silence. Time stopped. The world narrowed to nothing but the space between them, the air crackling with forces that had nothing to do with pack hierarchy and everything to do with something far older and more primal than political dominance. His wolf was there, behind those dark eyes, staring directly into hers with an intensity that should have sent her animal cowering in terror. Instead, her wolf rose to meet that gaze with something that felt like recognition between equals, an acknowledgement that transcended every rule of submission she had ever been taught. The Alpha King took a step forward, his movement causing a ripple of renewed submission from every other person in the arena. But his attention remained fixed on Kira, confusion and something else flickering across his features as he tried to understand what he was witnessing. Impossible!" breathed Marcus Blackwood, his voice barely audible above the sound of his own wolf whimpering with the need to show deeper submission. "No wolf can stand in the presence of the Alpha King. No animal is strong enough to resist that level of command." But Kira's wolf wasn't resisting anything. It was responding, but not with the cowering deference that everyone expected. Instead, her animal displayed behaviour that had no name in any pack law she had ever learned, a complex mixture of acknowledgement and evaluation that spoke to instincts buried so deep in her genetic memory that she didn't have words to describe what was happening. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed, and she felt the full weight of his attention focus on her, like sunlight concentrated through glass. The pressure should have driven her to her knees, should have forced her wolf into the desperate submission that every other animal in the arena was displaying. Instead, something inside her chest unfurled like a banner being raised, meeting his dominance not with defiance, but with something that felt like an answering call. "What are you?" he asked, his voice carrying across the arena with the kind of authority that could shake mountains. Not a command for submission, but a question born of genuine bewilderment at finding something that didn't fit into any category his experience had prepared him to understand. Kira opened her mouth to give him the response everyone expected, the acknowledgement of her worthlessness and her animal's defectiveness. But the words that emerged came from some place deeper than conscious thought, some ancient knowledge that her wolf carried in its bones. "I don't know," she said, her voice steady despite the enormity of what was happening around them, "but my wolf does." The confession hung in the air, between them like a challenge and an invitation combined, carrying implications that neither of them fully understood, but that made the very foundations of the arena seem to tremble with anticipation. Because something was shifting in the space between their locked gazes, some recognition that had nothing to do with pack politics and everything to do with forces that predated every law of dominance written in their world. The Alpha King took another step toward her, and Kira felt her wolf rise to meet whatever was coming with an eagerness that bordered on desperate hunger, as if her animal had been starving for this moment, this recognition, this meeting of something that finally matched whatever criteria lived in the deepest places of its ancient soul. Around them, the entire pack watched in stunned silence as their most powerful alpha and their most defective wolf girl faced each other across an arena that suddenly felt charged with the kind of power that could reshape the world. Chapter 4. Into the Ring. The ceremonial trials began at midnight, under a moon so full it cast silver shadows across the arena floor, like molten metal poured into ancient patterns. One by one, the pack's unmated wolves were called forward to demonstrate their loyalty to the Alpha King, each performance a carefully choreographed display of submission that had been practiced and perfected over weeks of preparation. Kira watched from the edges of the crowd as Connor Stormwind's wolf prostrated itself so completely before the Alpha King that its belly touched the cold stone, every line of its body screaming acknowledgement of unworthiness before superior power. The Alpha King nodded once, a gesture of acceptance that sent visible relief flooding through Connor's human form as his wolf was dismissed with the casual acknowledgement due to a properly functioning pack member. Derek Moonfall followed with an equally flawless display, his dark brown wolf dropping into submission so profound it looked like worship, trembling with the effort of containing its terror in the presence of such overwhelming dominance. Again the Alpha King's nod of approval, the brief acknowledgement that marked another successful demonstration of pack hierarchy functioning exactly as it should. "Beautiful," murmured Selene Nightshade, her silver-white wolf pressed against her consciousness with anticipation of its own moment to shine. Each one knows exactly how to honour the natural order, how to show proper respect for true authority. Her words carried the poisonous sweetness that always preceded her cruelest observations, and Kira felt the familiar weight of dozens of stares turning her way as pack members anticipated the coming spectacle of her own inevitable failure. Because everyone knew what would happen when her defective wolf was called into the ring. Everyone expected the same stubborn refusal that had marked every interaction with authority for the past 3 years. But inside her chest her wolf stirred with something that felt nothing like the resignation or fear that should accompany such certain doom. Instead, her animal coiled with anticipation that made her skin prickle with awareness, as if it knew something she didn't about what was going to happen when they finally faced the Alpha King in formal trial. "Kira Thornfield," called handler Marcus Blackwood, his voice carrying the particular tone of someone announcing an execution. "Present your wolf for judgment." The arena fell into the kind of silence that preceded either miracles or disasters, hundreds of pairs of eyes tracking her movement as she walked toward the centre of the ceremonial space. Her bare feet made no sound against the stone, but she could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against her shoulders like physical force, the collective held breath of a pack waiting to witness the moment their most problematic member finally met her fate. The Alpha King stood in the centre of the ring, his presence so overwhelming that the very air around him seemed to shimmer with barely contained power. This close, she could see the predatory grace in every line of his massive frame, the way his dark eyes tracked her approach with the focused attention of something deciding whether she represented threat or prey. "Shift," he commanded, his voice carrying the kind of authority that could force transformation from any wolf within 100 miles. The single word hit her consciousness like a hammer blow, demanding immediate obedience from every cell in her body that carried wolf genetics. But instead of the usual struggle against foreign dominance that marked her interactions with pack authority, Kira felt her wolf rise to the surface with an eagerness that stole her breath. The transformation that usually required effort and concentration flowed through her like water finding its natural course, bones reshaping and muscles reforming with a fluidity that spoke to perfect harmony between her human and animal selves. When she stood on 4 legs in the centre of the arena, her wolf's coat gleaming like pewter in the moonlight, the expected gasps of shock and dismay didn't come. Instead, a profound silence settled over the gathered crowd, the kind of stillness that accompanied the witnessing of something that didn't fit into any category their experience had prepared them to understand. Because her wolf wasn't prostrating itself in the desperate submission that everyone expected, but neither was it showing the aggressive defiance that would mark it as a rogue threat requiring elimination. Instead, her animal stood with a dignity that had no name in pack law, its silver-grey head held high as it regarded the Alpha King with something that looked almost like recognition between equals. The Alpha King circled her slowly, his own wolf visible behind his human eyes as he tried to categorize what he was witnessing. Power rolled off him in waves so intense that several pack members at the arena's edge stumbled under the weight of it. But Kira's wolf remained steady, its attention fixed on the legendary ruler with the kind of focus that spoke to forces deeper than political hierarchy. "Submit," he commanded, the word carrying enough dominance to drive a normal wolf to its belly in desperate acknowledgement of unworthiness. "Show proper deference to your alpha." Her wolf tilted its head slightly, considering the command with what looked almost like curiosity. Then, in a movement so unprecedented that it drew gasps of shock from every witness, her animal took 2 steps forward and lowered its front legs in a bow that was somehow both respectful and regal, a gesture that acknowledged the Alpha King's authority while maintaining its own inherent dignity. It wasn't submission in any form the pack had ever witnessed. It was recognition, acknowledgement between equals, the kind of respectful greeting that might pass between allied rulers rather than the desperate prostration of a lesser animal before its superior. "Impossible," breathed Marcus Blackwood, his voice cracking with the strain of trying to process what he was seeing. "No wolf bows like that. No animal shows that kind of dignity in the presence of true dominance." But Elder Tobias Ravencrest stepped forward from the crowd, his ancient eyes bright with something that looked almost like satisfaction as he watched the unprecedented display unfolding in the arena's centre. "Not impossible, boy. Forgotten. There are bloodlines that bow only to their equals, wolves that recognize authority not through fear, but through kinship." The Alpha King had gone completely still, his dark gaze fixed on Kira's wolf with an intensity that made the air crackle with forces neither of them fully understood. When he spoke, his voice carried a bewilderment that bordered on awe. "What are you?" Her wolf's response was to take another step forward, closing the distance between them until she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame. Instead of the cowering retreat that should have followed such proximity to overwhelming power, her animal stretched its neck upward and touched its nose to his palm, in a gesture so intimate and trusting that it drew shocked murmurs from every witness. The moment their skin made contact, lightning seemed to race between them, a connection so profound and immediate that both the Alpha King and Kira stumbled under the weight of it. Golden light flickered at the edges of her vision, And somewhere in the depths of her consciousness, she heard her wolf's voice for the first time in her life, speaking a single word that explained everything and nothing at all. Mate. The Alpha King jerked his hand back as if burned, his eyes wide with shock and confusion as he stared down at the silver-grey wolf that had somehow managed to shatter every rule of pack hierarchy with a single touch. Around them, the arena had fallen into the kind of silence that accompanied the witnessing of miracles. Hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on the impossible tableau of their most powerful alpha and their most defective wolf girl, sharing a moment of recognition that defied every law of dominance written in their world. "This isn't possible," he whispered, but his words carried no conviction, only the desperate denial of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been turned upside down by a creature that shouldn't exist. Kira's wolf settled onto its haunches and regarded him with patient eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient knowledge, as if it had been waiting its entire life for this moment of recognition, and was perfectly content to let him process the implications at his own pace. Because they both knew, with the certainty that came from forces older than conscious thought, that everything had just changed in ways that neither politics nor pack law would be able to control. Chapter 5. The Impossible Response. The golden light that had flickered between them when their skin touched lingered in the air like the afterglow of lightning, visible to every witness in the arena as something that defied both pack law and natural order. Kira's wolf remained sitting calmly in the centre of the ceremonial ring, its silver-grey coat shimmering with an inner luminescence that seemed to pulse in rhythm with whatever force had just connected them. The Alpha King stared down at her with an expression that cycled through shock, confusion, and something that looked dangerously close to recognition. His massive frame trembled with the effort of containing whatever response her touch had triggered, his dark eyes wide with the kind of bewilderment that came from having every certainty about the world suddenly called into question. "That's not possible," he whispered, his voice carrying across the silent arena, with the hollow sound of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just crumbled. "Wolves they can't—" He trailed off, apparently unable to find words for what he had just experienced. But Elder Tobias Ravencrest stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face bright with satisfaction as he watched the legendary ruler struggle to process the impossible. "They can, Your Majesty, when the bloodlines are old enough and the recognition runs deep enough. What you're seeing isn't defiance or madness, it's acknowledgement between equals." "Equals?" Celine Nightshade's voice cracked like a whip across the arena, her perfect composure finally shattering under the weight of witnessing something that threatened everything she had built her identity around. "That worthless creature isn't equal to anything. Her wolf is broken, defective, unable to show proper submission to any authority. This is just another display of the same madness she's been showing for 3 years. Her words carried the desperate edge of someone clinging to a worldview that was being systematically demolished before her eyes, but they lacked the conviction that had always made her cruelty so effective. Because everyone in the arena could see the golden light that still shimmered faintly around Kira's wolf, could feel the shift in the very air that spoke to forces beyond political hierarchy asserting their presence. "Madness doesn't create recognition," Elder Tobias replied calmly, his ancient gaze fixed on the Alpha King's face, with the satisfaction of someone watching prophecy unfold exactly as foretold. "Madness doesn't call to power and receive an answer. What happened when they touched wasn't the response of a broken animal to overwhelming dominance, it was the response of like calling to like." The implications of his words hit the gathered crowd like physical blows, sending ripples of shocked murmurs through pack members who had spent years accepting Kira's worthlessness as established fact. Because if Elder Tobias was right, if her wolf's behaviour wasn't defiance but recognition, then everything they thought they knew about bloodlines and hierarchy and the natural order of their world had been built on foundations that were crumbling beneath their feet. Marcus Blackwood pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with the kind of rage that came from having authority challenged in ways he lacked the power to control. With respect, Elder, there are no bloodlines that bow to the Alpha King as an equal. There is no wolf alive that carries the kind of power that would justify such recognition. This girl is nobody, from nowhere, with parents who died as Omegas in service to this pack. Her bloodline is documented, tracked, verified as utterly unremarkable. Documented by whom? Elder Tobias asked quietly, and something in his tone made the hair on the back of Kira's neck rise with sudden awareness. Records can be altered. Boy, bloodlines can be hidden. Sometimes the most powerful families find it necessary to disappear their children into obscurity for reasons that have nothing to do with their worth and everything to do with their survival. The Alpha King had been listening to this exchange with the focused attention of someone trying to piece together a puzzle whose solution would reshape everything he thought he understood about power and destiny. Now he stepped closer to Kira's wolf, his movements careful and deliberate as if approaching something that might bolt or explode depending on how he handled the next few moments. "Show me," he commanded, but his voice carried none of the overwhelming dominance that had marked his earlier words. Instead, he spoke with the careful respect of someone addressing an equal whose true nature he was only beginning to understand. "If what the Elder says is true, if your wolf recognizes something in me that goes beyond pack hierarchy, then show me what you see." Kira felt her animal rise to its feet with fluid grace, every line of its body radiating a dignity that 3 years of daily humiliation had been unable to touch. Her wolf padded forward until it stood directly in front of the Alpha King, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his massive frame and smell the complex scent of power and wildness that clung to him like incense. Then, in a movement so unprecedented that it drew gasps of shock from every witness, her wolf reared up on its hind legs and placed its front paws on the Alpha King's chest, stretching upward to meet his gaze at eye level. The position was intimate, trusting, completely vulnerable in a way that should have been impossible in the presence of such overwhelming dominance. But instead of the violent response that such presumption should have triggered, the Alpha King went perfectly still, his dark eyes locked on hers as golden light began to pulse between them with increasing intensity. When he spoke, his voice carried the hushed reverence of someone witnessing a miracle he had never expected to see. "Your eyes," he whispered, wonder bleeding through every word. "They're not brown, they're gold, pure gold, like liquid sunlight. How did I not see that before?" Because they had been brown, Kira realized with a shock that left her reeling. Her eyes had been brown for her entire life, the same unremarkable shade that marked her as utterly ordinary in a world where eye colour often indicated the strength of supernatural bloodlines. But now, reflecting in the Alpha King's dilated pupils, she could see the molten gold that had somehow replaced her human brown with something that spoke to power she had never known she possessed. "The recognition awakens what was sleeping," Elder Tobias said softly, his voice carrying across the arena with the weight of ancient knowledge. "Some bloodlines remain dormant until they encounter their match, their equal, their destined counterpart." The wolf knew what the girl could not remember. It was waiting for the right moment to reveal what had always been hidden beneath the surface. The Alpha King's hands came up to frame Kira's wolf's face, his touch gentle despite the tremor in his fingers that spoke to barely controlled emotion. "What are you?" he asked again, but this time the question carried wonder instead of confusion, awe instead of bewilderment. Her wolf's answer came not in words but in action, leaning into his touch with complete trust as golden light flared around them both like sunrise breaking over the horizon. And in that moment of perfect connection, with the eyes of an entire pack, witnessing something that would be talked about in whispers for generations to come, Kira finally understood what her animal had been trying to tell her for 3 years. She wasn't broken. She wasn't defective. She wasn't the worthless Omega that everyone had told her she was since the day her parents died and left her with nothing but questions about her origins and her place in the world. She was something else entirely, something that had been hidden so well that even she hadn't known the truth about what lived in her bloodline, what power had been sleeping in her bones, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The Alpha King stepped back, his expressions cycling through emotions too complex to name as he stared at the silver-grey wolf whose golden eyes now blazed with inner fire. "This changes everything," he said quietly, his words carrying the weight of prophecy being fulfilled and destiny being claimed. And as if the universe itself was responding to that declaration, thunder rolled across the clear night sky, and the first CTA break settled into the narrative like a breath held before the storm that would reshape their entire world. "We'll be right back," seemed to whisper through the golden light that still pulsed between them. "But first, if you're loving this impossible love story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell. Trust me, you're going to want to know what happens when a wolf that was never supposed to exist meets the one alpha who can recognize what she truly is." Chapter 6. Ancient Bloodlines. The sacred forest bordered the eastern edge of the palace grounds, its ancient trees standing like silent sentinels guarding secrets that predated the establishment of any pack territory in the northern kingdoms. Elder Tobias Ravencrest led Kira through paths so old they seemed worn into the earth by centuries of pilgrims seeking wisdom from forces that existed beyond the reach of political authority. 3 hours had passed since the impossible recognition in the arena. 3 hours since golden light had flared between her and the Alpha King and shattered every assumption about her place in the world. The ceremonial trials had been suspended indefinitely while pack leadership struggled to process what they had witnessed, leaving Kira free to follow the Elder into the depths of the forest where truth could be spoken without fear of political consequences. "Your parents," Elder Tobias began, his weathered hands pushing aside low-hanging branches as they walked deeper into the grove, "were not the simple Omega servants that pack records claim them to be." Kira's newly golden eyes tracked every shadow between the trees, her senses heightened to levels she had never experienced before the awakening that had begun in the arena. "I don't understand. I saw their service records, their bloodline documentation. They were listed as unremarkable, without any special lineage or supernatural abilities." "Records can lie, child, especially when the truth would endanger the lives of those being recorded." The Elder paused beside a massive oak whose trunk bore carved symbols so ancient they seemed to pulse with their own inner light. "Your mother was Luna Isabel Thornfield, last surviving heir of the Moonspear bloodline. Your father was Gabriel Thornfield, descended from the Shadow Wolves of the Eastern Territories. Both bloodlines were thought extinct, their members hunted to near extinction during the Great Purge 30 years ago." The names meant nothing to Kira's human consciousness, but her wolf stirred with recognition so profound it made her breath catch in her throat. Images flashed behind her closed eyelids, memories that couldn't be hers but felt more real than anything she had ever experienced. Silver wolves running beneath moonlight, their coats gleaming with the same inner luminescence she had seen in her own reflection. Wolves whose eyes blazed with golden fire, whose presence commanded respect not through dominance, but through the quiet dignity of those born to lead. "The Moonspear line," she whispered, the words emerging from some deep place of genetic memory. They were the wolf lords of the ancient kingdoms, the bloodline that could speak to wild wolves, that could command the elements themselves through their connection to lunar power. Elder Tobias nodded, satisfaction flickering across his weathered features as he watched understanding dawn in her transformed gaze. "Your wolf knew, even when your human mind had been conditioned to forget. It refused to bow to lesser authority because it was bred from lines that bowed only to their equals. It was waiting for recognition from someone whose bloodline matched the ancient strength that flows in your veins." "But how is that possible?" If my parents were truly from such powerful bloodlines, how did they end up as servants in the Silver Moon Pack? How did I grow up believing I was nothing more than an unwanted orphan with a defective wolf? The elder's expression darkened, ancient anger flickering in his eyes as he touched the carved symbols on the oak's trunk. Because 30 years ago, a coalition of ambitious pack leaders decided that the old bloodlines posed too great a threat to their newly established territories. They launched what they called the Great Purge, a systematic campaign to eliminate anyone whose genetic heritage included the Wolf Lord lines. Hundreds died. Entire families were wiped out in single nights, their bloodlines scattered to the wind. Kira felt her wolf pace restlessly in her chest, responding to the elder's words with a fury that seemed to burn through her bones like liquid fire. Not just anger at the injustice, but recognition of a pattern that explained so much about her life, her treatment, her sense of never quite belonging anywhere she had been placed. Your parents survived by abandoning their names, their titles, their rightful places in the supernatural hierarchy. They became servants, took omega positions, hid their true nature so completely that even their own daughter grew up believing the lie. Elder Tobias turned from the oak to face her directly, his ancient gaze bright with something that looked almost like hope. But bloodlines like yours don't stay hidden forever. The power finds a way to surface, especially when it encounters its match. The Alpha King, Kira said quietly, understanding beginning to crystallize like ice forming on still water. His bloodline is old enough to recognize mine. That's why my wolf responded to him the way it did. It wasn't submission or defiance, it was acknowledgement between equals. King Lysander Blackthorn carries the blood of the Storm Kings, the northern rulers whose power rivaled even the Moonspear line in the days before the territories were divided into the pack system we know today. The elder smiled with the satisfaction of a teacher watching a particularly gifted student grasp a complex lesson. When your wolf touched him, it wasn't just recognizing a mate, it was recognizing the only bloodline powerful enough to understand what you truly are. The implications of his words hit Kira like a physical force, sending her stumbling against the ancient oak as the full scope of her heritage finally became clear. She wasn't just some random girl whose wolf happened to be stubborn. She was the heir to a bloodline that had once ruled kingdoms, whose power had been so threatening to modern pack structures that an entire coalition had united to destroy it. But if that's true, if I'm really descended from the Wolf Lords, then why didn't my abilities manifest before now? Why did it take the Alpha King's presence to awaken whatever power I carry? Elder Tobias reached into the leather pouch at his belt and withdrew a small vial filled with liquid that seemed to glow with its own inner light. Because your parents took precautions to ensure your survival, they had a witch bind your abilities, suppress your wolf's true nature until you were old enough and strong enough to claim your heritage without being destroyed by those who would see it as a threat. He held up the vial, and Kira could see symbols etched into the glass that matched the carvings on the oak beside them. This contains the suppressant that has been keeping your bloodline dormant, a single drop mixed into your food every month since you were 5 years old, administered by someone who cared enough about your safety to maintain the binding even after your parents died. Someone in the pack has been protecting me, Kira asked, her voice barely above a whisper as she stared at the vial that had shaped her entire existence without her knowledge. Someone has known the truth about my heritage this whole time? Someone who understood that the daughter of Luna Isabel and Gabriel Thornfield would one day need to reclaim her birthright, and who was willing to wait 30 years for the right moment to let that awakening begin. The elder tucked the vial back into his pouch, his movements careful and reverent. The binding is weakening now, dissolving under the pressure of recognition from a bloodline powerful enough to call to your true nature. Within days, maybe hours, you'll have access to abilities that have been sleeping in your bones since birth. Kira felt her wolf surge with anticipation at his words. No longer the patient creature that had endured years of suppression, but something fierce and eager that had finally tasted the freedom it had been denied. Power hummed beneath her skin like electricity, begging to be released, begging to be claimed by someone who finally understood what it meant to carry the blood of wolves who had once commanded the very elements themselves. "What do I do?" she asked, golden eyes blazing with inner fire as she turned to face the elder who had become her guide through this impossible transformation. "How do I learn to use power I never knew existed? How do I become worthy of a heritage I was never taught to claim?" Elder Tobias smiled, and for the first time since she had known him, he looked not like a weathered pack member, but like someone who had been waiting his entire life for this moment. "You start by understanding that worthiness was never something you needed to earn, child. It was something you were born with, something that has been waiting in your bloodline for the right moment to emerge. The wolf knew. It always knew. And now, finally, so do you." Chapter 7. Political Manoeuvring. The dawn following Kira's revelation in the sacred forest brought with it a tension so thick it seemed to permeate the very stones of the Silver Moon compound. News of the impossible recognition between their most worthless pack member and the Alpha King had spread through the territory like wildfire, carrying with it whispers of ancient bloodlines and powers that threatened to upend the carefully maintained order that had governed their world for 3 decades. Selene Nightshade stood before the ornate mirror in her private chambers, her reflection showing none of the turmoil that raged beneath her perfect exterior. For 22 years she had been groomed for this moment, trained and prepared to become the mate of the most powerful alpha their kind had ever known. Her bloodline was impeccable, her wolf flawless in its obedience and beauty, her political value beyond question. And now some orphaned nobody with a defective animal was threatening to steal everything she had worked her entire life to achieve. "My lady," her personal attendant ventured carefully, "perhaps the king's reaction last night was merely surprise at such unprecedented behaviour. Surely, when he has time to consider the political implications, he'll understand that your union is essential for the stability of the Northern Territories." Selene's laugh was sharp as winter wind, carrying none of the musical quality that had charmed dozens of powerful males throughout her carefully orchestrated rise through pack society. "Political implications mean nothing to a mate bond, you fool. If what happened in that arena was truly recognition between destined partners, then no amount of political necessity will overcome the supernatural compulsion to claim her." She turned from the mirror to pace across her chamber, her silver-white wolf pressing against her consciousness with desperate need to do something, anything, to eliminate the threat that had emerged from nowhere to steal her rightfully earned position. But mate bonds require 2 willing participants to complete, and there are ways to ensure that one of those participants is no longer available to complete anything at all. Her attendant paled at the implications in her tone, but Selene was already moving toward the ornate desk where she conducted the correspondence that had built her network of allies throughout the pack territories. If direct confrontation wouldn't work, if she couldn't challenge Kira's claim through traditional means, then she would have to resort to methods that skirted the edges of pack law without technically violating its letter. Meanwhile, in the Alpha King's private study, Lysander Blackthorn stood before a wall lined with ancient texts and bloodline records, his dark eyes scanning document after document as he tried to find some reference to what he had experienced in the ceremonial arena. The recognition had been immediate and undeniable, a connection so profound it had shaken the very foundations of everything he thought he understood about power and destiny and the supernatural forces that governed their kind. But recognition meant complications he wasn't sure he was prepared to handle. His mating with Selene Nightshade had been arranged to cement alliances between the most powerful packs in the northern kingdoms, a political necessity that would ensure the stability of territories that had been won through decades of careful negotiation and strategic marriage bonds. "Your Majesty," his chief adviser Marcus Blackwood entered the study with the careful deference of someone delivering news he knew would be unwelcome. The pack leaders are requesting an immediate conference. They're concerned about the implications of last night's events for the political agreements that have been in place for months. Lysander didn't turn from the ancient texts, his fingers tracing symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light as he searched for answers to questions he had never expected to need to ask. Let me guess. They want reassurance that I'll proceed with the planned mating ceremony, despite what happened with the Thornfield girl. They're suggesting that whatever occurred in the arena was an anomaly, possibly the result of some kind of supernatural manipulation designed to disrupt the established order. Marcus's voice carried the particular tone of someone repeating arguments he didn't entirely believe. They're recommending that the girl be removed from the compound until after your mating with Lady Nightshade is completed, to prevent any further complications. The book in Lysander's hands creaked ominously as his grip tightened, power rolling off him in waves that made the air in the study shimmer with barely contained force. Removed how exactly? And by whose authority do they presume to make such recommendations about someone who may carry bloodlines older than their entire pack structures? They're citing security concerns, Your Majesty, suggesting that someone with such unprecedented abilities poses a potential threat to the stability of the ceremonial proceedings. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, clearly aware that he was delivering messages that bordered on treasonous. There have been suggestions that the girl's wolf might be carrying some kind of supernatural contamination that could spread to other pack members if left unchecked. Lysander finally turned from the texts, his eyes blazing with the kind of fury that had once reduced entire armies to ash and bone. Contamination. They're calling a bloodline that once ruled kingdoms a contamination. His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Tell the pack leaders that if anyone lays a hand on Kira Thornfield without my explicit permission, they'll discover exactly what it means to face the wrath of someone whose bloodline has never forgotten how to wage war. But even as he delivered the threat that would protect her from direct action, Lysander knew that the political forces arrayed against them were far more subtle and dangerous than open confrontation. Selene Nightshade had spent years building a network of allies and obligations that stretched across every major pack in the Northern Territories. If she decided that Kira posed an unacceptable threat to her ambitions, she had resources and connections that could make the girl disappear without leaving any trail that would lead back to her involvement. In her simple quarters near the servants' wing, Kira sat on her narrow bed with her knees drawn up to her chest, trying to process the magnitude of what Elder Tobias had revealed about her heritage. The power that had been suppressed for so long was stirring more strongly with each passing hour, manifesting as heightened senses that let her hear conversations taking place rooms away and catch scent trails that told stories about the emotions and intentions of everyone in the compound. Which was how she knew that something was wrong, very wrong. The compound hummed with a tension that spoke to forces gathering like storm clouds, political manoeuvring happening in corners and private chambers where deals were being struck and plans were being made. She could smell the sharp scent of fear mixed with determination, the metallic tang of desperation that came from people who felt their carefully constructed world beginning to crumble beneath their feet. And underneath it all, threading through the complex web of political anxiety, was something else entirely. Something that smelled like violence carefully contained, like predators circling prey while waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Her wolf paced restlessly in her chest, no longer the patient creature that had endured years of suppression, but something fierce and alert that recognized danger, approaching from multiple directions at once. The recognition in the arena had awakened more than just her dormant abilities. It had painted a target on her back, marked her as a threat to every person whose power depended on maintaining the current order. And as the afternoon shadows grew longer and the political manoeuvring grew more desperate, Kira began to understand that her biggest challenge wouldn't be learning to control the abilities that were awakening in her bloodline. It would be surviving long enough to claim the destiny that had been hidden from her for her entire life. Outside her window, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, and somewhere in the depths of the compound, plans were being made that would determine whether the last heir of the Moonspear bloodline lived to see another dawn. Chapter 8. The Awakening Power. The attack came at midnight, when the compound lay shrouded in darkness, and most of the pack members slept peacefully in their beds, unaware that the political tensions of the day were about to explode into violence that would change everything. Kira woke to the sound of her door being forced open, 3 figures in dark clothing moving through her small chamber with the practiced stealth of assassins who had done this before. Her newly heightened senses caught their scents immediately: determination mixed with fear, the metallic tang of weapons, and underneath it all, the distinctive perfume that marked them as servants of Selene Nightshade. "Quietly now," whispered the leader, his voice muffled by the cloth covering his face. "The lady wants this to look like an accident, a tragic case of an unstable wolf finally succumbing to the madness that's been building for years." But as the first assassin reached for her, something extraordinary happened. The power that had been stirring beneath Kira's skin since the recognition in the arena suddenly erupted like a dam bursting, flooding her system with abilities that had been locked away for her entire life. Time seemed to slow as her wolf surged to the surface, not with the careful control she had always maintained, but with the explosive force of a bloodline that had once commanded the very elements themselves. Her transformation was unlike anything she had ever experienced. Bones reshaping with fluid grace instead of painful cracking, muscles expanding with strength that felt limitless, senses sharpening to levels that made the world around her blazingly clear. The assassin's hand never reached her throat. Instead, he found himself facing a wolf whose silver-grey coat now gleamed with inner luminescence, whose golden eyes blazed with power that seemed to reach into his very soul and catalogue every fear, every weakness, every doubt he had ever carried. Her presence filled the small chamber like liquid moonlight, overwhelming and undeniable, in ways that made the men who had come to kill her stumble backward with expressions of sudden terror. "That's not possible!" breathed the second assassin, his weapon trembling in his grip as he stared at the creature that had replaced the defenseless girl they had been sent to eliminate. "Wolves they can't project that kind of dominance, not from a nobody, not from an Omega." But Kira's wolf was no Omega, and as the full scope of her heritage finally awakened, everyone in the chamber could feel the truth of what Elder Tobias had told her in the sacred forest. This was a bloodline that had once ruled kingdoms, wolves whose power had been so threatening to the established order that an entire coalition had united to destroy them. The third assassin lunged forward with desperate courage, his silver blade aimed at her heart with the precision of someone trained to kill supernatural creatures. But before the weapon could find its target, Kira's wolf moved with speed that defied every law of physics she had ever been taught, flowing around the attack like water before her jaws closed on his wrist with enough force to shatter bone. His scream echoed through the chamber, a sound of agony and terror that carried across the compound and woke every sleeping pack member within a quarter mile. But more than that, it was the sound of recognition, the moment when someone who had dismissed her as worthless finally understood what he was facing. "You want to know what I am?" Kira's voice emerged from her wolf form with the kind of dual-tone resonance that marked the most powerful supernatural bloodlines. "I am Luna Isabel's daughter. I am Gabriel Thornfield's heir. I am the last of the Moonspear line, and I am done hiding from people who think my survival is negotiable." Power erupted from her in waves that cracked the stone walls of her chamber. Ancient abilities that had been suppressed for 18 years, suddenly free to express themselves without restraint. The remaining assassins were thrown backward by forces they couldn't see or understand. their weapons clattering uselessly to the floor as they struggled to remain conscious under the weight of dominance that belonged to creatures who had once commanded respect from dragons themselves. The compound's alarm bells began to ring, their bronze voices carrying across the territory with news that something unprecedented was happening in the servants' quarters. But by the time the first responders arrived, they found not a murdered girl, but something that defied every category their experience had prepared them to understand. Kira stood in human form in the centre of her destroyed chamber, her golden eyes blazing with inner fire as she surveyed the 3 unconscious men who had been sent to eliminate her. Her clothes hung in tatters from the explosive transformation, but her skin bore no wounds, no marks of violence except for the strange silver symbols that had appeared along her arms like tattoos made of liquid moonlight. "Lady Thornfield," said Marcus Blackwood, his voice carrying a respect she had never heard before as he took in the scene of destruction and the men who would never again underestimate what they were facing. "The Alpha King requests your immediate presence in his private study." But as Kira stepped over the unconscious assassins and walked through the compound toward whatever confrontation awaited her, she could feel eyes watching her from every shadow, every window, every corner where pack members had gathered to witness something that would be whispered about for generations to come. Because the girl who had spent 3 years being dismissed as worthless was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to make the air shimmer with barely contained power. The silver markings on her arms pulsed with each heartbeat, ancient symbols that marked her as heir to bloodlines that had shaped the supernatural world long before the current pack structures had been established. And in the Alpha King's private study, Lysander Blackthorn waited with expressions that cycled between awe and desire, and something that looked dangerously like recognition of his equal. The political manoeuvring that had dominated the day was about to become irrelevant, because the mate bond that had sparked between them in the arena was no longer a whisper of possibility. It was a roar of destiny that could no longer be denied, suppressed, or negotiated away by those who thought they could control forces older than their entire civilization. The transformation was complete, the hiding was over, and as Kira walked through corridors filled with pack members who no longer dared to meet her blazing golden gaze, she finally understood what Elder Tobias had been trying to tell her in the sacred forest. She had never been broken. She had been sleeping. And now, finally, she was awake. Don't miss what happens next in this incredible transformation story. If you're as captivated by Kira's awakening as we are, make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because the Alpha King's reaction to her true power is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. Trust us, you won't want to miss a single moment of what comes next. Chapter 9. The Hunt Begins. The Alpha King's private study had never felt smaller than it did with Kira, standing in the centre of it, power radiating from her transformed form like heat from a forge. The silver markings along her arms pulsed with each heartbeat, ancient symbols that seemed to drink in the lamplight and reflect it back as something more primal, more alive than mere illumination should be. Lysander circled her slowly, his dark eyes cataloguing every change that the awakening had wrought in the girl who had knelt before him just hours earlier. Her golden gaze tracked his movement with the predatory awareness of something that no longer needed to fear anything in the world, and when their eyes met, the mate bond that had sparked between them in the arena roared to life with an intensity that made the very air crackle with supernatural electricity. "Show me," he commanded, but his voice carried none of the overwhelming dominance that had marked their earlier encounters. Instead, he spoke with the careful respect of someone addressing an equal whose true capabilities he was only beginning to understand. "Show me what you've become." Kira lifted her hands, turning them so that the silver markings caught the light and blazed with inner fire. "I don't fully understand it myself," she admitted, wonder bleeding through her voice as she watched power flow beneath her skin like liquid moonlight. "But I can feel everything. Every heartbeat in the compound, every whispered conversation, every emotion bleeding through the mate bonds of mated pairs. It's like the world has suddenly become transparent, and I can see the connections that hold everything together. "And what do you see when you look at me?" Lysander asked, stepping closer until the heat of his massive frame mingled with the supernatural energy that surrounded her like a living thing. Her golden eyes fixed on his face with an intensity that seemed to reach into his very soul, seeing past the political authority and legendary reputation to something far more fundamental. "I see someone whose bloodline recognizes mine. Someone whose wolf has been waiting as long as mine has for this recognition. Someone who's spent his entire life carrying power that was meant to be shared rather than wielded alone." The truth of her words hit him like a physical blow, confirming suspicions he had carried for years about the lonely burden of absolute authority. But before he could respond, the study door burst open and Marcus Blackwood stumbled inside, his face pale with terror and his hands shaking as he struggled to deliver news that would change everything. "Your Majesty, we have a problem, several problems." His voice cracked with the strain of trying to maintain composure while his world crumbled around him. "Lady Nightshade has called in favours from every allied pack in the Northern Territories. She's claiming that the Thornfield girl used dark magic to manipulate the mate bond recognition, that she poses a supernatural threat that requires immediate elimination." Lysander's response was a growl that made the windows rattle in their frames, power rolling off him in waves so intense that Marcus dropped to his knees without conscious thought. "On whose authority does she make such claims? By what right does she presume to judge the legitimacy of forces older than her entire bloodline?" "She's citing the supernatural threat protocols established after the Great Purge," Marcus gasped, struggling to speak under the weight of royal fury. "Any individual displaying abilities associated with the extinct Wolflord bloodlines can be classified as a rogue threat and eliminated without trial if 3 or more pack leaders agree to the designation." The implications of his words hit the room like a meteor strike. Kira felt her wolf surge with fury at the revelation that the same laws used to massacre her family 3 decades ago were now being invoked to justify her own destruction. But underneath the rage was something else, a cold understanding that political manoeuvring had evolved into open warfare, and she was standing at the centre of a battlefield she had never asked to enter. "How many packs has she contacted?" Lysander asked, his voice dropping to the whisper that always preceded his most lethal actions. 7 so far, with 3 more expected to respond within hours. The Ironwood pack has already agreed to provide hunters, and the Stormcrest territory is mobilizing their warwolves." Marcus's words came faster as panic overrode his usual careful composure. "They're not just talking about capture or containment, Your Majesty. They want her dead, and they want it done before the mate bond can complete and complicate the political arrangements that have kept the Northern Territories stable for 30 years. Kira stepped toward the window, her enhanced senses picking up movement in the forests that bordered the compound. Dark shapes flowed between the trees with the practiced stealth of hunters who specialized in tracking supernatural prey, their scents carrying the metallic tang of silver weapons and the bitter herbs used to mask their presence from wolf senses. "They're already here," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what was gathering in the darkness beyond the compound walls. "I can smell them, dozens of them, maybe more, positioned to prevent any escape while they decide how best to eliminate a threat they've spent 30 years believing was extinct." Lysander joined her at the window, his powerful frame radiating the kind of deadly calm that marked predators preparing for battle. "You have a choice, Kira. I can try to negotiate with the pack leaders, use political pressure and economic leverage to convince them that you pose no threat to their territories. Or, she asked, though her wolf already knew what alternative he was offering. "Or we run. Tonight. Now. Before they can tighten the noose completely." His dark eyes burned with something that looked like desperate hope, mixed with the kind of reckless courage that had made him legendary among their kind. I have safe houses beyond the northern territories, places where we could disappear until the political situation stabilizes, and I can return with enough force to reclaim what's rightfully ours." The offer hung between them like a lifeline thrown to someone drowning in forces beyond their control. But as Kira considered the implications of fleeing into the night with the most powerful alpha their kind had ever known, her wolf stirred with something that felt like recognition of destiny finally arriving at the moment of choice. "If we run, they win," she said, her golden eyes blazing with inner fire as she turned to face him fully. "They get to write the story about the dangerous rogue who seduced the Alpha King with dark magic and had to be eliminated for the safety of all civilized wolves. They get to bury the truth about what really happened during the Great Purge and ensure that no other Wolf Lord bloodlines ever dare to surface and challenge their version of reality. And if we stay, we face odds that no rational person would accept," Lysander replied, but his voice carried approval rather than discouragement. 7 packs worth of hunters, all armed with silver and specialized in killing creatures exactly like what you've become. Political isolation from every allied territory, economic warfare that could destabilize the entire Northern Kingdom structure. Kira felt her wolf settle into the kind of calm that preceded either victory or glorious destruction, ancient courage flowing through her veins like fire as she finally understood what her parents had died protecting and what her bloodline had always been meant to defend. "Then we fight," she said simply, the words carrying the weight of prophecy and the promise of a war that would reshape their entire world. Not just for us, but for every Wolf Lord heir who's been hiding in terror for 30 years, for every bloodline that's been suppressed and every truth that's been buried beneath political convenience. Lysander's smile was sharp as winter starlight, predatory and magnificent in ways that made her heart race with more than just supernatural attraction. "In that case, my Luna, we'd better make sure we win." And as hunters closed in from every direction and the most powerful packs in the northern territories mobilized for a war they thought would be over before dawn, the last heir of the Moonspear bloodline and the Storm King, who had recognized her as his equal, began to plan a battle that would determine whether love could triumph over politics, whether truth could survive deliberate suppression, and whether 2 wolves whose bloodlines had once ruled kingdoms could reclaim a destiny that had been stolen from them before they were ever born.